Good afternoon. I've been instructed that I'm to get started. I am literally a man who needs no introduction, and that's because my name is Jeff Mann. This is my contact information. Thanks to Atlantic Security Conference for letting me speak here this afternoon. I was here several years ago, and they gave me the intro of a lifetime. More on that later. Has anybody seen me speak here 3 years ago? It was a little hot, by the way. Should I move it lower? I'm fine. You think that. And I'm not the least intimidated that you're sitting there listening to my talk. Just real briefly, the company that I work for has paid for me to be here, and in exchange, I say where I work, which is Online Business Systems. It's actually a Canadian company, which was really cool because it made it really easy to get through Canadian Customs yesterday, saying that I work for a Canadian Customs company. If you've never been through Canadian Customs as a U.S. employee coming up here to do any kind of work, you know what I'm talking about. But enough of that. I also want to apologize right off the bat. I've been in the information security business a long time, and I realized a little while ago that everything I know about security I learned from somebody else. So there is no original thought here is what I'm getting at. I want to start off with a little bit about me, just in case you don't know who I am, a little bit of my background, and it's not to brag about myself or anything, but just to give you guys the context of why I'm up here with some opinions about where cybersecurity is today, where we've come from, and where we're going. My background, essentially, I've been doing this kind of work for about 37 years, give or take, and the gist of it, or the getting started of it, was at NSA, and I was there for about 10 years. I've been out in the private sector for 22 years, mostly working as a consultant and an advisor with a lot of different companies, and a good chunk of that was as a pen tester, a vulnerability assessment person, or sometimes known as Red Team. Part of my talk today is talking about the definitions of terms. So I call myself a pen tester, or at least a former pen tester. How about a hacker? And then the dirty little three-letter word, I did PCI for about 10 years. To put things in context, and I stole this off of Twitter this morning, while Cliff was doing his thing back in, it was 1986, right? That's what year I started at NSA. And we had a slogan back then that we had on T-shirts, and that was the image of it. I'm supposed to laugh at that. That's very good. Real briefly, I was there for 10 years. I started out as a cryptologist or cryptanalyst working in the manual crypto systems shop, which was on the InfoSec side of the house, which came to be known information assurance. But actually, when I started there, it was called communication security. And to the best of my knowledge, I was responsible for the first software-based encryption system that NSA ever produced. And what we did was we took a one-time pad, and we had a customer that said, we've got this thing on our desks, this IBM PC. Isn't there some way we can do this encryption and decryption that takes hours to do by hand? Couldn't we do it on the computer? And I thought, well, yeah, we can do that. So in an engineering organization that produced hardware and never thought of anything like software, and this was sort of before the internet was a thing, and certainly before network systems were a thing, and I wouldn't recommend you doing this on a network system today, but we were able to produce a computer program that automated the process of doing a one-time pad. In the midst of doing that, I was working with another customer, and when I say customer, I'm talking about primarily the military, some branch of the armed forces. This particular branch happened to be U.S. Special Forces. They used a particular type of one-time pad, which used what they called the Visionaire square or Visionaire table, which was the alphabets offset against itself 26 times, but the body of the table was the alphabet reversed. This produced 123 unique three-letter combinations called trigraphs, and they would memorize them, and that's how they would do the encryption and the decryption. One letter was plain text, one letter was key from the one-time pad, and the third letter became cipher. And because the three letters were unique, ago, I was at another conference, and somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, have you ever heard of the Diana crypto system?" And I'm like, "No, I don't think I've heard of the Diana crypto system." And I Googled it and found this Etsy page, and somebody has made my wheel, and it's made in wood, and that's a real page. If you Google Diana crypto system, if you want to get one of these wheels, they're out there for sale. So the guy that was asking me about it, once I saw this, I said, "You happen to be talking to the guy that invented it." So that was kind of cool. I think it's kind of cool that it's out there, and I'm hoping to get it into someday the National Cryptologic Museum. I did get in touch with the guy that made it, and he sent me a couple of them, plus a few other things. Like that thing in the middle was a wooden model of the Enigma cipher wheels, and the one on the bottom is really complicated, and I haven't figured it out yet, but it looks really cool. So anyway, go to Etsy, you can buy all this stuff. They're really cool. Middle part of my NSA career, I was over in the operations side of the houses, which is what most people are familiar with in terms of NSA. That's the operations. That's where we're intercepting communications from everybody else in the world and doing things. I happened to be there during Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And then finally, the third tour, I was back on the InfoSec side of the house, and this is where the internet starts coming into play. I was working in fielded systems evaluations. We were looking at the cryptography and the crypto systems that we put out in the field because we had learned over time that one of the ways that we, NSA, were breaking a lot of the systems on the operations side of the house, a lot of the systems that our adversaries used, was because we were taking advantage of things like they didn't use them properly. They didn't change default settings. They used key more than one time. Like a one-time pad is great. It can't be broken unless you decide to save paper and use the same page of key for a day or a week or a month. Then it becomes cryptographically solvable. So we were looking at our own systems, and part of that group was looking at what was now known as network systems. And that was around the time when the internet started becoming available. Mosaic, the first commercial browser, came out, and so the whole internet thing took off. And I was with a bunch of guys that we wanted to learn hacking. We wanted to learn how to be pen testers. It was probably around this time where the Nova Special came out. What year did the Nova Special come out? 92-ish, 3-ish, something like. I mean, it was required viewing for us. Got a great kick out of it. Yes. Well, we required it of ourselves. It wasn't officially required. Everything we were doing was not sanctioned, but that's another story for another day. Anyway, this book came out a couple years ago called Dark Territories. Anybody heard the book? Read the book? Don't raise your hand. I can't see a thing. Never mind. Chapter 4 is titled Eligible Receiver. Eligible Receiver was the first joint forces hack of the entire military. It happened in 1997, actually after I left NSA. But in that chapter, there's this paragraph, and I will read it dramatically to you because I have fun doing this. Somewhere in the middle there, during its most sensitive drills, the red team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through not one, two combination locked doors. Well, we got a big kick out of this. One of my friends that was in this office we were a group of pen testers, hackers. We were the first group of pen testers, hackers. We had an office, and we nicknamed it the Pit. We were trying to live hacker culture, and one of us was a MASH fan. And the doctors in MASH, their tent they call it the Swamp, and we didn't want to just say Swamp, so we came up with the Pit. And somehow we ended up in a book, so we thought that was kind of cool. This is an aerial shot of some buildings that are just west of BWI Airport down in the United States in Maryland. Coincidentally, sort of near Fort Meade. And that building up there in the corner, and that corner of that building is where the Pit was. It was an actual office. And the Pit was essentially a group of guys that were the first hackers, pen testers at NSA. Two of them still work there. Two of them are out four of us are out in the private sector. I only have permission to say who one of the other ones is, and that's Ron Gula, founder of Tenable Network Security. Anyway, and then PCI, this is the time where somebody should be giving me a drink, but I did PCI, and I wasn't just I had some very unique experience as a QSA. I was involved with a group that was on the ground after a lot of the major data breaches back in the mid-2000s. The TJX financials, all of them. They were the Alberto Gonzalez ring, Heartland Payment Systems. They were the first service provider to be publicly breached and famously breached. And I was part of the teams that were on the ground getting those companies back into a secure mode following the PCI standard. I've worked with lots of companies over the years, so I have a diversity of experience both in the government as well as the private sector. So, but where I'm getting at is the very first lesson in security that I learned actually goes back to 1984. I was a summer intern at a naval research base down in Maryland. Again, that's in the United States. It's near Washington, D.C. And my job for the summer was to take all the data that this physicist had been storing in a safe for probably about 25 years. He'd gotten some money to buy this newfangled thing called a desktop PC. I want to say that's the model that I was using. If you're an old timer and you can appreciate this, when we would turn it on, you had the option of booting into not one but two operating systems, either DOS or CPM. I had the fun after the first week or so of just playing around, just learning it. I accidentally deleted everything and had to start over. That was kind of fun. My boss wasn't a little bit disturbed, but not too much. But my first lesson in security was I committed a security violation. I left the safe unlocked one night. And being young and somewhat naive and maybe a little bit cocky, if you will, I kind of had this attitude that, well, what's the big deal? You know, I left the safe unlocked, but the safe is, you know, in a facility that's surrounded by barbed wire fences, has roaming guards walking around the campus. You had to go through security to get into the actual building. The actual office only had one combination lock door, not two. That came later at NSA. But there was a locked door, and they had security guards on patrol. In fact, the security guards, they would go into the offices at night because they had nothing better to do, and they would try all the safes, and that's how they discovered that it was left unlocked. So I came in the morning, opened up the safe, and there was this pink slip, please come see security. Well, my boss was Irish, I think, of descent, so he got a little bit red-faced, and he was not happy that I had broken this fundamental security rule, this rule that was part of the fabric and the culture of the whole organization by leaving the safe open. The second time it happened, he was apoplectic. And I don't know if you've tried any of the lock picking out there, if you're familiar with cracking spin dials on safes, but if you don't know, when you're locking those things, you got to spin the dial a couple times to set all the tumblers. And I apparently had just done, half a spin, and the security guards were apparently, able to spin it back and get it open. So I was in trouble, not once, but twice. Nothing technology-oriented, nothing computer, internet, cyber-oriented, but my first lesson in security was I had not followed a process that was part of several layers of security that were all designed to keep data safe. So hold that thought. Where I'm getting at in this conversation today, and I really intend this to be a conversation, and because I can't see you, we're not going to get to talk a whole lot, so hopefully it's just trying to get you to think a little bit. I think differently about security because I've been in the business a long time, and I was classically trained by the DoD, who used to do security. They were they were the experts in security. And what I'm thinking is as I've been in this business for so long, is that there's something wrong because as much of the cool stuff that we're learning and we do and we talk about at conferences such as this, there's still breaches happening on a pretty regular basis, and pretty major breaches. And I've given up trying to keep this slide current because it's almost impossible. I did update a little bit just in the last couple of weeks, but I guess my point is, Microsoft had a little bit issue their last patch Tuesday, and they had to pull a patch. That's not exactly a security issue. In the early days of the internet, when everything was wired and wireless first came around, all the security experts says, don't use wireless, it will never catch on. Well, you can see where that's gone. And all these years, passwords being stored in the clear, passwords being easily guessed. Uh, we throw so much technology and so much product and so much thinking, and we're so consumed with all these aspects of cybersecurity that the basic things still happen. The safe gets left unlocked, the passwords are there, and that bugs me. And what I want to try to suggest and what I want to try to get us to think about is there a different way? Is there something that we can not necessarily think about differently about security, but maybe there's a lesson that we haven't learned from the past that we haven't fully implemented. This is probably the biggest screen I've ever put this up on, so I don't know if it's legible or not, but you can find this on the internet and look at it. It basically boils down to all sorts of different facets of what a CISO needs to know to do his job. And I've been in this business 37 years. I can touch on most of those things, but I would not claim to be an expert in all of those areas. And I would defy anyone to claim that they're an expert in all those areas. And I would even go so far as to say, what are we doing here if that is what we need to do to secure our organizations these days? Individually, all necessary, but all together, how do we manage to keep up with it? It's no wonder breaches are happening. So, I want to rethink about security a little bit. And I'm not saying anything new. I'm trying to suggest some of the old that maybe we haven't thought about yet. Dismiss me if you want. That's quite all right. In the early days of data protection from a national security perspective, this was the kind of attitude that a lot of the government and a lot of the politicians had. There was people that didn't think it was necessary to do all this type of security stuff for data protection purposes, and these are people that were fighting getting organizations like NSA and some of its predecessors even funded and started back in our history. But at its most fundamental level, I think what we're involved in these days, even what we call it something different, cybersecurity, internet security, network security, it all boils back to trying to, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, we're trying to protect data. And most of us are probably familiar with the three facets of data security. That we call it CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is pretty straightforward. This is nothing new. But it boils down to, can you keep your data safe? Can you protect it from being altered? And can you make sure that the data is always available when it needs to be available? There's a few nuances to that have been added in our technology world, in our internet-connected world, but you can still argue that it more or less falls down to those three categories. Anybody remember that movie? And it is? What's the name of the movie? Sneakers, thank you. There's a scene in the movie where the good guy and the bad guy, Robert Redford and Ben Kingsley, they're having a conversation, and Ben Kingsley is making a statement, and I want to read it to you because I think it still holds true today. In fact, I think it's always going to hold true. And he says, "There's a war out there, old friend, a world war. And it's not about who's got the most bullets. It's about who controls the information. What we see and hear, how we work, what we think. It's all about the information." Now, for me to have an old-timer moment, does anybody know what they're sitting on right now in this shot? Hey, Cray, I knew you would know. Anybody else know? It's a Cray computer. It's a mock-up of a Cray computer. If you want to see a real Cray computer, you can go to Maryland and go to the Fort Meade National Cryptologic Museum. They have a Cray computer in the museum. That's one of the computers that I literally used to work on when I was a cryptologist at NSA. So stuff that I used to do is now in a museum. And the last time I shared that at a talk, somebody shouted out, "When are you going to the museum? Be in the museum." But this is totally just a free advertisement for the National Cryptologic Museum. I know it's a haul for you guys from up here in the Maritimes, but definitely worth your while. If you do happen to ever find your way down to Maryland and want to go to the museum, get in touch with me. If I'm around, I'd be happy to give you a tour and show you lots and lots of really cool stuff there. Anyway, that's a sidebar. my point is, and what I keep coming back to is, I don't think technology is ever going to solve our problems. I think, in fact, that technology is our problem. But somewhere along the line in our rush to throw information and data on the internet and making streaming and freely available and all the data at our fingertips at any time, at any place, in any way, in any form, I think we collectively have already agreed to give up on the security of that data just by the mere fact that we're putting it out there. Just a thought I had a couple weeks ago. Agree or disagree. But one of my early lessons that I was taught by a chief scientist at NSA, and this goes back to when I was trying to design a software system to be used as an encryption system, was whatever can be created by man can be broken by man. And virtually all the cryptography that's out there in our computer world today, even though it's millions and billions of bytes and bits and super long keys and huge prime numbers and so on and so forth, and not even to sidebar into quantum cryptography or quantum computing, but it's all solvable. It might take a million years to solve brute force, but there's a solution out there and it's ultimately solvable. Not the one-time pad. The one-time pad, if you use it right, it can't be broken. So as far as I'm concerned, we should still be using one-time pads. It's not very practical, though. So this gets into what I want to talk about in terms of what I learned classically about security and pose a couple questions to you. I learned back at NSA what we knew then and what we call now the risk equation. If you Google risk equation, there's hundreds, if not thousands of them out there. A lot of product vendors, a lot of security consultants, advisors, auditors, very often will try to use or talk about the risk equation. So there's lots of formulas out there. There's lots of formulas that go to great lengths to try to actually come up with real working numbers. I've never been into that as much. I like to try to simplify these concepts so that more people can understand. In my experience over the years of working with customers, organizations that were having to do security, particularly in the PCI world, these were companies that security wasn't in their DNA. It wasn't something that they had experience with. It wasn't part of their culture. They didn't have people that had long backgrounds in security. They were pretty much dragged kicking and screaming into it. It's not exactly true for every organization. There's certainly organizations out there that are more proactive about security, but I think the majority of organizations out there don't really understand security, don't really want to have to do it, so they just tell us what to do to get by, tell us what to do to get the box checked. Don't make us think, just tell us what kind of boxes we need, how many, where do we put them, and what color lights should the lights be blinking. I mean, that's been my experience over many years. But what I've tried to do is simplify and try to help them understand what's going on. So I start with a very simplified version of the basic risk equation. Now, I'm not a mathematician, so I probably don't get all the terminology right that I could, but risk, in its most basic form, is a function of three different variables: vulnerabilities, threats, and what I was taught is countermeasures, but for the sake of our discussion, let's think security maybe is what countermeasures is, but we'll talk more about that. But notice that the risk equation doesn't technically have security in it at all. And these are terms that we hear all the time, we use all the time, we throw them around all the time, especially at industry conferences, vendor display booths. I was walking around there earlier today trying to see which of these words were popping up, and didn't see too many of them out there actually today, but there's a new set of buzzwords that are out there. And I think part of the problem is we who claim to be security professionals or claim to be the ones that know just how bad things are, I don't think we always do a good job of explaining things in a way that people that are the decision makers can understand and make well-informed decisions. So the way I learned this equation and the definitions of the components are simply this. A vulnerability in its most basic form is a weakness, and there's longer definitions, but the way I think of vulnerabilities are, it's a weakness. anywhere. Systems, people, processes, technology, products, hardware, software, it's a weakness. The threats, and this is the one that's a little bit tricky, the way I learned threats are the bad guys. Threats are the ones that are your enemy. They're the ones that are out to get you. They're the ones that you're fighting against. Again, think DoD military terms. Cold War. I was at NSA during the Cold War. We used to have a threat office that would inform us if we were going to be doing any kind of international travel. We had to call the threat office to find out what the threats were in the particular geographic region that we were going to be traveling. And of course, I had to do that one time. I was going to West Germany, and I called the threat office. I forget what year it was exactly. And they said, oh yeah, the threat's very high. There's been rumors of some sort of terrorist activity that's brewing. Something's going to happen. And I was kind of like, great, so what am I going to do with this information? Well, the explanation I got from my management was, well, it's good to know that so that you can be more careful. I did not tell my wife that the threat level was high until many years later, and I still think she hasn't forgiven me for that. But, I saw a process weakness. The threat was high. What do I do about it? Not travel? No, I still needed to travel. Anyway, threats are bad guys. Threats are people, the way I taught it. And then countermeasures, or the mitigation. It's what you do to counter all the things that are out there in terms of vulnerabilities and threats. So if you look back at it, risk then, I think everybody understands this intuitively, but just to explain it, the goal is to reduce risk, to make it lower at its most basic level. Make it low enough that you can live with it, make it low enough that as an organization, you're comfortable with it. It's risk, there's different kinds of risk, financial risk of data loss. You can sum it all up in different ways, but at its most basic component, it's lowering risk. And to do that, and this is where I have a problem with our industry, you do it by lowering vulnerabilities or lowering threats or doing more in terms of countermeasures. And it seems like this whole industry, or a good portion of this industry, is focused on that vulnerability variable, as if that's the only one that can really change, as if that's the only one that we really have any control over. So, by the way, you can find this in various versions out on the internet, and it's kind of changed names over the years, but I originally knew it as the National Information Systems Security Glossary, the InfoSec Glossary. This is where I got my classic definitions from, and I wanted to share these with you, just so you know I'm not making it up. So the definition from the glossary, which was produced by NSA many, many years ago and has been adapted over time, risk is the possibility that a particular threat will adversely impact an information system by exploiting a particular vulnerability. Sounds pretty straightforward. The threat's a little bit different, and the threat's a little bit more what I hear in terms of threats today in terms of our conversation and dialogue as an industry, which only bugs me because I think of threats as people, but threats have become the things that happen, the things that are done to our systems, the things that are introduced to our systems, either on purpose or accidentally. So any circumstance or event with the potential to adversely impact an information system, and so on and so forth. This is actually a slide from a deck that I used over 20 years ago when I was first out in the private sector trying to teach what I'd learned about security to my audience, my customers, my prospects. And we listed the threats, and you can see most of them are really people. They're actual beings. There's a couple things in there that are events. So I think threats, what I've evolved to is threats are either people or events. And the events are more often than not caused by people, or at least by the inactions or the wrong actions of people. And then we also had to talk about, and we learned about, at least classically, why would the bad guys, the threats, want to do the things to you? My question for you is, I think this slide kind of stands today. It hasn't changed a whole lot. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but again, something to think about. The definition of vulnerability out of the glossary: weaknesses in information systems. weaknesses in procedures, weaknesses in internal controls, and so on and so forth. It's not just the systems, the technology, it's everything around it, and anything that could go wrong, might go wrong, gets lumped in as a vulnerability. And again, as somebody that's been in the business a long time and has learned to trust certain tools and certain programs and things over time, I pulled out some of these, and I don't even, vulnerabilities aren't a vulnerability today unless they have a logo. But some of these things are affecting systems that have been around for 20 years that we've discovered vulnerabilities and things that we've trusted for vulnerabilities. So it got me to the point where I kind of thought maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't think of vulnerabilities as something that we can manipulate as much in that risk equation. But let's get through this and we'll talk more about that. Countermeasures then, finally. Again, these are the things that you do to sort of negate the effect or the impact of those other components of the equation. So, and it can be anything. In our context, it's very often technology. We think of security products, security solutions. Very often they're monitoring solutions. Very often they're things that are designed to detect what we would call anomalies, things that aren't supposed to be happening or happening at different times, or anything that's out of the ordinary that might indicate that something's going on. But my question then is, in that whole equation, if risk is some sort of a product of vulnerabilities and threats and countermeasures, and if so much of our industry is focused on the vulnerability component, the thought I've had for a while that I just submit to you for thinking about, and maybe we can talk about, is what if all the stuff that we're doing to try to drive down the vulnerability counts in an organization, in our private lives, if you follow my logic that in this equation there's three different variables, and maybe one's called security, and one's called threats, and one is called vulnerability, if there's already a variable in the equation that's called security, and it's not vulnerability, then what is all the stuff that we're doing about vulnerabilities? Maybe that's not security at all. Maybe that's just our job. Maybe our job is to produce secure software and applications that don't have vulnerabilities in them. Maybe it's our job to administer systems, applications, servers, devices that don't have the vulnerabilities in them. Obviously, it's security related, but maybe it's not fundamentally what security is. So I asked the question, if security is another variable in this equation, and it's not all the stuff that we do about vulnerabilities, and it's not all the stuff that we do with threats, then what is it? It's an open-ended question. Somebody laugh. Cliff? So let's go back to the risk equation. And this one's a little bit different. And this one I've adapted more or less for what I would call the private sector, the commercial world. When I learned risk in the DoD, basically what was at risk in one way, shape, or form at the DoD level, at the military level, was human life. So there was sort of this concept of that there was money was object. I worked at NSA at a time where there was huge budgets, and we got to buy everything. We had one of everything at least. I think we had a couple Cray computers, and they were not cheap. We had source code to Unix operating systems before Linux ever existed. So we had the opportunity to purchase and have source code so we could get into the internals of how early versions of the Unix operating system worked, and so on and so forth. So in the military terms, it all had to do with human life. You know, whether we're protecting our military on the battlefield, whether we're protecting our citizens at home or abroad, our State Department, our ambassadors, whatever it is, it all loosely related and revolved around the protection of human life. American life, US life, but human life. In the commercial context, though, it's different. In the commercial context, most companies aren't out there, worrying about the life of their employees or management. It really has to do with the profitability of the company, the organization. It has to do with money. So new to this equation is trying to assign some value to the data that you're ultimately trying to protect in this risk-based model. But it really boils down to there's the, as far as the risk is, and again I'm simplifying, but risk in a commercial sense is the ability for an organization to earn revenue on the one hand, and the other risk is how much it's going to cost them to conduct business. And that cost then gets spread out over all the equation. It's why this industry exists, because there's so much money out there that's spent, and there's so much money out there to be made, because every step of the process, whether you call it security or not, every element that goes into this whole thing that we're loosely calling risk, there's a dollar cost to it. So the equation at the end of the day has to do with how much are you willing to spend and where to get to some sort of level of where you think you're safe in terms of risk. And then, of course, if something bad still happens, are you prepared for the cost associated with that? It's a little bit different way of thinking about security, I think, and it's again, it's not new, it's out there, and probably most of us intuitively understand this, but it's certainly a little bit different from the dynamic of protecting human life, protecting the American way, protecting our, our citizens. It's protecting our profitability. It's protecting our bottom line. It's how much or how little we're going to spend of our profits in order to keep this business going. And that is not bad in and of itself. It's just a different way of thinking of things. And I think it puts things in a different perspective. And I think it's why we so often get, don't explain security to me, just tell me how much I have to spend. Because people understand intuitively at some level, it's a money, it's a dollars game. They don't necessarily understand that there's more to it than that. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that maybe rather than coming up with something continuously new and shiny and different that we can spend more money on in hopes of solving this overall problem, maybe we need to think more about doing more to teach and explain exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish in your organization, whether it's where you work or it's the customer that you're working on behalf of, to explain what's the big picture, what's really at play here, explain that it's about data, help companies understand what it is that they have that's worth protecting, that needs protecting, try to figure out some value to it. The money's going to need to be spent somewhere along the way. I guess my contention is, I think where my customers have felt like I have helped them over the years, it's when I've helped them make a more informed decision about their spending. Not that they weren't going to spend the money. And in PCI, especially in the early days, there was a lot of companies spending a lot of money. Anyway, so I go back to this main question. First of all, agreeing on the terminology, or at least understanding that there's differences to the terminology, the components of the risk equation. I guess my frustration very often has been, I hear people in conversations, especially at the vendor booths, not to pick on the vendors, but I hear people using these terms like risk and vulnerability and threat almost interchangeably, like they're synonymous, not apparently understanding that there are different components of this overall equation and that there's differences between them. And again, ultimately, it boils down to, for me, and it's a question that I put to you guys to think about, is if the name of the game, if what we're really doing is more about risk, then where does security fit in, and what is security at the end of the day? I'll give a little bit of my opinion, but I really don't want to give too much of my opinion, because I think it's something that we should all think about, and we should all ask ourselves, well, what is it that we're talking about? I hear two things very commonly when I hear people talking about security, or if I stop and ask them, what is security? I think the predominant view is a perception that security or being secure is a state that you achieve. You make your network, your systems, your applications, your databases impenetrable, impervious to attack. The bad guys, the hackers, the pen testers, the red teamers, the malwares, nothing can penetrate, nothing can get to you. And so there's this state of being secure. I think that's the prevailing attitude about it. Again, my view is a little bit different. What I see as being secure, or what security is, has more to do with all the things that you have to do after you've done all the stuff to reduce your vulnerabilities, or to identify, at least point out what your threats are. It's things like knowing your network, knowing your systems, knowing your environment, knowing the habits of your people. It's ongoing. This is one of the hardest lessons that a lot of the customers from PCI days have had to learn, is PCI is not a once a year go through all this rigmarole to get to the finish line where you're compliant and you have that report produced. In that standard, there's all sorts of things that you're supposed to be doing on an hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, ongoing basis. So ultimately, I think my view of what security is that it's a verb. It's something that you do. It's not a noun. It's not an adjective. It's not a state that you achieve. Arguably, it's both. But I think too often we're sort of locked up on the, we got to be secure. We got to secure all things. The pragmatic part of me says, well, no, that's not practical. Nobody's ever going to drive the vulnerability count down to zero. Hasn't happened yet. And if you're honest with yourselves, I don't think it's going to happen. So, and again, I'm not a mathematician, but there's probably some term for when a variable in an equation is to be treated more like a constant. If you're a mathematician, you can explain it to me later what it is. But if it's a constant and threats are relatively constant, what's left to do? It's that thing that you do on an ongoing basis that's security, that has to do more about knowing what's going on, which means observation, which means knowing the processes, the data flows, doing all sorts of things to monitor and react. That to me is what security is ultimately. You can agree with me or disagree with me. Hopefully I'm just making you think a little bit and maybe think differently, maybe not in a new way, but maybe in a way you haven't thought of for a while. Our time is running up. If you're at all intrigued with what I've been talking about, you want to hear more, I am part of a podcast called Paul's Security Weekly. I'm one of the hosts. You can tune in. We usually broadcast every week. In fact, we're broadcasting tomorrow, but I'll be here, so I won't be on it. And here's the escort I had at Atlantic Security Conference 3 years ago. They had a bunch of stormtroopers dressed up here, and they walked me to the stage. I'm also in a book called Tribe of Hackers. If you haven't heard about it yet, tribeofhackers.com. It's a charitable thing. If you buy the book, all the proceeds are going to charity. There's 70 people in it that have been recognized as people that are innovators, influencers, some young, some old, new, different. It's a pretty good cross cut of different people in our industry, all answering the same questions. There's a set of 14 questions, and we all responded to. So it's a good book to get a hold of. I'm still working through reading it all. Several of the speakers here today are in the book. I'll leave it to you to figure out who they are. I don't know if Cliff, if you ever met Gene Spafford in your days? Yep. There's a group of people that get together with Gene Spafford once a year at RSA conference, and I was allowed to be into that group a couple years ago, and they call themselves the Cabal of the Curmudgeons. From an educational perspective, there's an organization called Hack for Kids that put out this educational card game. It's an interactive fantasy type trading card game. I don't play it because I don't do that stuff, but there's face cards called Anachronism, so I'm part of that. If you go to freaker.life, you can get yourself a couple decks, and the front of the cards are all about the history of hacking and freaking from the 70s up through the 90s. So it's kind of a good educational thing. My contact information again, if you're still interested in getting in touch with me. And finally, are there any questions?